Hi, this is your host Apnil Bhartiya and welcome to second episode of CISO Insights. And today we have with us once again Steve Winterfeld, Advisory CISO at Akamai. Steve, it's great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this week's topic.
Yeah, and today's topic is cyber materiality requirements. Before we, of course, jump into this topic, I would like to hear from you is what is cyber materiality, cyber material? How do companies define it, and how would you define it?
You know, the reason we're talking about this now is recently the SEC, Security Exchange Commission, who governs publicly traded companies, came out with a new rule. And, you know, it's always interesting if you're a sports fan and you see a new rule coming out with football, being that American football or the rest of the world's football. When you hear about this new rule, you really don't know how it's going to change the game because you don't know how the referees are going to implement it. And I think that's where we are now. So there's this new rule out about cyber materiality. And I realized that I didn't really understand this. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I was collaborating with somebody and we came out with a book on first principles on cybersecurity. And one of the key concepts in there was, you know, a first principle is the reduction of the probability of a material impact due to a cyber event over the next 3 years. And then we spent the time in the book talking about how we in cybersecurity do that. And then recently I realized as I started to dig into this is not something we can do within the cybersecurity team. So let me give an example. The SEC chairman said, whether a company loses a factory in a fire or millions of files in a cybersecurity incident, it may be considered material to investors. So that's kind of where we're at. So now I'm gonna give you some definitions of materiality. A substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider it important in making investor decisions. Another aspect would be significantly altered the total mix of information made available. These are so vague. And if you go to GAAP, which is generally accepted accounting principles, they have a definition. If you're not a US company and you use the International Financial Reporting Standards, they have yet another definition of materiality. And so all of this is like, it reminds me back when I was a CISO at Nordstrom Bank, back in the day when Nordstrom and Cabela's, I think, were the last two banks that were owned by a retailer. And the OCC, Officer of Comptroller of Currency, came in and they said, well, what's your cyber risk appetite? I said, well, what do you mean by that? What is the cyber risk appetite? Like, we don't want to define it. We want you to come up with your own because we don't want to tell you how to run your business. I'm like, well, that's not helpful. Can you give me an example? Well, we don't want to give you an example because we don't want to, you know, and so we're right back there with these very vague guidance. And the last part of this is the reporting timeline. So you have 48 hours to report on something like this. It could be a single incident. It could be a series of incidents that become material. And unless you have a law enforcement exception because there's an investigation going on, that's a real tight timeline.
Excellent. Thank you for giving us a vague definition there. Can you also talk about what is the difference between critical high threats and material threats?
So yeah, this is interesting. I have, as a CISO, I would have a risk register, a risk portfolio, however you want to manage all your risk. And in that, traditionally, I have, you know, high, critical, medium, low risk in there. I may display it through a heat map or a dashboard or an XY diagram. But I'm kind of trying to say these are the critical problems. Very few CISOs traditionally talked about material problems. And so now is a critical material. Is these five criticals together become material? And that's where I want us to understand that as we talk about materiality, we need to remember that we can't say, okay, this is material and my portfolio or risk register doesn't change. We have to understand what the relationship is and be able to talk during, worst case, a class action lawsuit about why something was a critical that became material wasn't listed in our material, threats. It's just kind of crosswalking the two programs. Your 10K is made by the disclosure team. I know, talking to some of my peers, there are companies where the cyber risk in the 10Ks, they never really even consulted the cyber security team.
As you said, when you were talking and they're like, we don't want to define what materiality will mean for your organizations. Of course, we can look at from Akamai's perspective, but once again, I don't want it to define for others. But are there any key indicators, criterias, or I just want to know what kind of materiality is there irrespective of what kind of organization one is running there?
So I think as you build out your cyber materiality program, the first is, what are your material risk? In a traditional materiality discussion, you could say it would be material if it impacted our annual revenue by 10%, our stock price by 15%, our production capabilities. Depending on your business model, you would talk about material risk. So now you have to talk about what are the cyber material risk. And it could be a cyber risk that caused one of those other materialities. It could be a unique risk. The next would be, what would be considered a material incident? One of the things we have is within the SOC is who you engage in the leadership change based on how big an impact a cyber incident could have. And so again, we want to say if an impact is this large, it is material, and not only does that require notification of a regulator, it might, and we'll probably talk about this later, an 8K or something like that. And so it is really important to define that as part of your program. Then there's discussion about what is a material threat. And so this is kind of the corollary to an incident. So what are the kind of threats that could become material? Business email compromise that stole so much money you couldn't make your payroll the next month. That could be an example of materiality. Ransomware that shut down your network. I would say that's probably material. And then something, as we look at this transformation, we have a lot of APIs out there. API abuse. I worry about threats at scale, and threats that are automated scale quickly. And something like API abuse, again, depending on your business model and what kind of information was scraped during that, could become material. And then the last is material weakness, or what I would call a material vulnerability. And then it would surprise me if you defined this and had one, because quite honestly, that should be beyond your risk appetite or your acceptable risk tolerance. But you should at least define what that would be.
And when we look at, whether we look at cyber material threats, risks, vulnerabilities, and we look at it from CISO's perspective, what kind of teams within an organization gets involved with that, are responsible for it, or play a role there? Is it developers, DevOps, or purely security teams?
As I look at my program and map this, I talk about this within my discussion of situational awareness. We have kind of a tactical situational awareness at the SOC where they're worried about systems. We have program where I'm worried about maybe a data breach. We have compliance, and then we have board level. I think materiality is at the board level. And here's where we need a team. I said earlier, I can't do this by myself. I need the cyber leadership. I need the CFO If we're publicly traded, the disclosure team, the people that write the public documents, the annual reports, I need legal. And so all of us have to get together and as a team kind of define these. And then we have to make that racy, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And who's responsible during a material incident for which part of this?
When we talk about cyber material threats, risk, vulnerabilities, can you also talk about the association with business? When I say business, of course, security is, sometimes security is critical for business continuity. But where, you also, hey, we need to have these strategies in place because it has a business value itself. So when your discussions are at the board level, we do talk about revenues, we do talk about, investments, we do talk about, hey, where the profits are going. So is there any business value associated with cyber material threats, risk, vulnerabilities?
So again, as we talked about, different business models, I may have a significant brand impact. I worked for Nordstrom. Nordstrom is an amazing company. My wife is still mad I left that discount. But a lot of theirs is their brand, their relationship with their customers. So they're very concerned about their brand. So if there was an incident and their customers, awesome customers, felt like there was a break in trust and they didn't trust the brand, that would be huge on the business side. So it could be from that extreme to, as we said before, ransomware, which has a direct operational impact. All of this is probably going to be tied back to exactly what you said. What is the business risk that's impacted by cyber, not what is the cyber risk in and of itself. But yeah, great question.
Thank you. Now, earlier you were talking about 10K. So I want to know what is 10K and how does it relate to cyber incident 8K?
Your 10K is your annual report. And there's international versions of this, but here in the US, there's a straight 10K is our financial annual report. And when we put that out, Section 2 is risk. And within that, the last few years, it has included cyber risk. And so these are fairly straightforward. And if you go read 3 or 4 10Ks, you'll see a lot of similarities, especially in the same industry. The Fortune 500 top 10 banks in America are all going to have similar cyber risk, typically. And so the 10K is a forward-looking and reverse. It is a huge document with a lot of financial, information, but what we're talking about is Section 2 risk. And then if there's something comes out, you want to make an announcement, it would be an 8K. And so if there was a cyber incident, you would go turn in your 8K to the SEC. And what is interesting here is there are already 8Ks out there for cyber. And because of the quick reporting, you'll see the first 8Ks are, we have had an incident and we're conducting an investigation, or we brought in resources to help us, or, so real quickly, the first 8K is we're having this. Then you do an amendment 1, 2, and 3 as you have more information. And here you might say, in a public release, you would say, we're continuing to find information. In an SEC announcement, you would say, we believe the investigation is going to cost us $5 million. We believe that, or another 8K had a section where, as of the date of this announcement, there have been filings for class action lawsuits in federal court in this state, in state court in this state, and in another country. And so there were already 3 class action lawsuits before they had even finished their investigation. And so those are the kind of announcement you would see in an 8K that would be different than a general release. And again, those are the things I, as if I were a stockholder and investor, want to understand.
Of course, I'm not going to ask you to share the whole playbook, but what advice you have? What should company be doing, once again, to ensure they contain these cyber material threats, risk, vulnerabilities?
I think, first of all, if you're a publicly traded company, definitely something that you need to prioritize. If you don't have these things in and you're ended up in filing an 8K for cyber incident, you don't have any documentation, you don't have a program, now you're at risk for negligence. So I would prioritize this fairly quickly. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving you legal advice. It's just my personal opinion. The next thing is I would build that team I talked about. Whether you're public or private, build the team, because even, like I said, GAP talks about materiality. Once you have that team, then go through those terms we talked about, define them, make sure you're all in agreement with what materiality would apply to cyber, and then document that plan. Write it out just like you do your breach plan. Kind of have, or if it's a subset of your breach plan, your crisis management plan, that's fine. And then ultimately validate that through an exercise. A plan that you haven't tested is not a plan. It's a plan to fail.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing this great insight. And as usual, I'm looking forward to our next episode. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.